The Ruthless Alpha's Healer, written by Short Story Queen. Chapter 1. The Boy in the Snow. The snow had long since covered his tracks. Bare branches, clawing the sky above, reached toward the darkening clouds, as if even the forest mourned what had gone wrong. Luca had stopped crying miles back. His cheeks were raw from the wind, and the sharp cold bit into his legs, through the torn knees of his pants. Every breath came thin and wet, wheezing where his ribs ached. He hadn't meant to run this far. Hadn't meant to run at all. But the fury in his father's voice had driven something small and trembling out of him. Something that refused to stay another minute in a house full of shadows. Now he was lost, and worse, he wasn't alone. The rogues came out of nowhere. 3 of them, lean and hungry, the stink of blood already in their fur. Luca's shift hadn't come yet, but he screamed loud enough to make the crows lift from the trees. He bit one, punched another, but claws beat fists every time. He went down hard on the ice, heat leaking out of his side, the scent of his own blood joining the snow. Then, nothing. When his eyes fluttered open again, it was dark. Firelight danced across unfamiliar walls, painting the rafters in golden shadows. He lay on a bed of fur and wool, a low hum of herbs in the air. The pain in his ribs throbbed slow and deep, but it was different now. Dull, medicated, wrapped tight in something warm and soft-smelling. A woman sat by the hearth. She didn't look at him. Her hands moved in silence, grinding dried roots with a mortar and pestle. Long black hair coiled down her back like shadow-made flesh. She worked with the focus of someone who'd forgotten how to speak, or never needed to. The room was small, but there was order in the way everything was placed. Dried herbs hanging like prayers, polished stones lined along the sill, a wolf pelt draped over the chair, old but cherished. Luca tried to sit up, but a sharp pain forced him back with a whimper. She turned then. No gasp, no rush to his side. Just a glance, steady, unreadable, as if she'd been expecting him to wake, but it didn't matter when. "You tore the stitches," she said softly. "Lie still." Her voice was low, smooth, with something cool in the way it settled. She moved to him without hurry, gathering a bowl and cloth from a nearby shelf. Her hands, when they touched his skin, were gentle, practiced, but impersonal, like she wasn't touching a boy, just a body that needed fixing. "You're not dead," she said after a moment. "That's something." He wanted to speak, but something about her, this strange woman in a cottage that smelled of old earth and wolf blood, held his tongue. He slept again. Ezra found the boy's scent long after the rogues had bled into the snow. The air still carried the kill stink of it. Those mutts had gotten bold, venturing that deep into his territory. If Luca was dead, if his son had bled out in the dirt while Ezra had sat at home swallowing his pride, he would gut every last rogue this side of the mountain. The trail ended near a hollow slope, where the earth dipped into dense pine and a faint, foreign scent curled up from beneath the snow. Not pack, not rogue. Something off. Not dangerous, but not known. The cottage stood alone between 3 frost-split trees, smoke curling from the chimney in a lazy coil. No fence, no sentries, just a low door, dark wood, and silence inside. He didn't knock. The door slammed open under his hand, the storm trailing in behind him in a gust of cold wind and fury. His son lay on a cot in the corner, alive, bandaged, fevered, but breathing. And beside him stood a woman. She didn't flinch. Not when he bared his teeth. Not when he stepped toward her like a blade. "You've got 3 seconds to tell me what you've done to my son." Her gaze moved over him, like fog through trees, slow, unbothered, unimpressed. "He was dying," she said. "Now he's not." Ezra stepped between her and the boy before he could stop himself. Thorn growled low in his chest, a warning he didn't voice. She looked like no threat. Barefoot, hair braided down her spine, wrapped in nothing more than wool and stubbornness. But there was something in the air around her. Not strength exactly, but something older. Undeclared. "You live out here alone?" "Yes." "You're not in a pack?" "No." "Why?" She turned back to her herbs, as if he'd asked the time of day. "I wasn't wanted." He watched her. Watched the way her hands didn't shake. Watched the flicker of gold in her eyes that shouldn't be there if her wolf was awake. "You're wolfless." A pause. She nodded once. "And still more used to your son than you were." The words hit harder than they should have. Ezra didn't move, didn't speak, didn't trust himself to. She didn't smirk, didn't twist the knife further, just wrung out the cloth and laid it gently back on Luca's brow, as if the boy wasn't the only one she was healing. Ezra looked at her hands, slim, blood-streaked, steady. A rogue, a wolfless one, and yet something in his gut crawled at the sight of her. Not fear, not disgust. Something worse, something that felt like recognition. "You're coming with me," he said. "No." That wasn't a request. She didn't move, but the air in the room shifted like the pressure before a storm. A pulse of something neither of them named. "You need me?" she asked. Ezra's jaw clenched. "Then ask." The silence cracked between them like thin ice. He stepped forward, inches away now, and the space between their bodies carried the charge of a storm not yet struck. She smelled like pine and smoke, old things buried in the bones of winter. She looked up at him without flinching. His voice dropped low. "Come. With me." Something in her eyes wavered, just for a breath. Then she turned, slowly, and packed the cloths away. She didn't say yes, but she didn't say no. And Ezra realized, as he watched her gather her basket and touch his son's shoulder with fingers that lingered too long, that something had just shifted. Not in her. In him. Chapter 2. The Alpha at the door. They traveled in silence. Eira walked several paces behind, her boots moving without sound over the snow-hushed earth. Ezra hadn't offered her a coat. She hadn't asked for one. She carried nothing but the satchel across her chest, filled with what she deemed essential. Salves, herbs, a small curved blade dulled with use. The rest she left behind without a backward glance. Her cottage, her quiet, her ghosts. Ezra never turned to look at her. He didn't need to. He could feel her, the same way he felt the pull of moonlight just before the shift. There was something unnatural about the way she moved. Light, precise, unhurried, despite the cold. He told himself it was because she didn't fear him. That was easier to accept than the alternative, that she felt nothing at all. The forest thinned. Iron Fang territory loomed just beyond the ridge, the old ward stones pulsing faintly under the frost. As they passed between them, Eira tensed, not visibly, not with her shoulders or jaw, but something in the air around her folded inward. The pack mind link hummed to life around them, a sudden static presence neither she nor her dormant wolf could enter. It excluded her by nature, by rule. Ezra glanced back once, saw the flicker in her eyes as the energy brushed past her without pause. She didn't flinch, but she didn't look at the stones again. By the time they reached the estate, night had fallen completely. The Iron Fang house was not a castle, but it wore one's bones. It sat atop a hill of black stone, wrapped in cold iron and silence. No torches burned. No welcoming pack emerged. The front doors opened as they approached, as if the house had learned long ago when to yield to its master. Eira stepped inside without hesitation. The heat hit her first, dry and cloying. Then the scent, male sweat, pine resin, fur, and something metallic just beneath. The walls were carved with ancient symbols, forgotten gods pressed into stone. The lighting came from scattered sconces, casting sharp lines across shadowed corners. It was not a home. It was a lair. Ezra spoke no greeting. He led her down a hall with the slow certainty of someone who never had to explain where he was going. At the end, a heavy door opened to reveal a private suite, not large, but thick with scent and shadow. Luca slept in the bed, the curve of his small body barely lifting the blanket. He breathed shallowly. Fever lingered. Eira moved without instruction, crossing to his side and pressing a cool hand to his neck. She opened her satchel, drew out a tincture, and spooned a few bitter drops into his mouth. She adjusted the bandages on his side, fingers grazing the bruises with a reverence that belonged more to ritual than healing. Ezra watched her work. There was no flourish, no wasted motion. She touched his son like he was something breakable, and not for the first time, Ezra felt the sharp twist of something he didn't have a name for. He could fight a rogue. He could tear down an enemy in a meeting hall. But he didn't know what to do with a woman who showed no fear of him and even less interest. When she finished tending to Luca, she stood and turned toward the hearth, lighting a small fire from dried kindling and resin-packed bark. The flames grew slow and steady, revealing more of her face in amber flicker. Pale skin, a faint scar under her chin, eyes that didn't match the rest of her, too watchful, too calm, like she'd already seen the worst the world could offer. "You'll stay here," Ezra said finally. His voice was lower than before, stripped of its usual threat. "Until he's healed." She looked at him fully now. The firelight didn't soften her expression, only made its sharpness clearer. "I'll need more supplies. I'll have them brought." And silence. He lifted a brow. "From your pack," she clarified. "I don't need to be stared at like a mistake." Ezra didn't answer immediately. He didn't know what to say to a woman who spoke with the bluntness of an alpha, without even a whisper of a wolf behind her words. Still, he nodded once. He would silence them. He always had. She didn't thank him. Instead, she moved to the corner of the room, where an old wooden chair sat under a small window. She sank into it slowly, wrapping her arms around herself, not out of cold, but habit. She looked like someone preparing for another long night of nothing. Ezra turned to leave. His hand brushed the doorframe, but he didn't open it. "You knew who he was," he said quietly. Her head tilted slightly. "I did. And you still helped him." Her eyes flicked toward the fire. "I help who bleeds." Ezra's jaw tensed. Something about her, this soft cruelty, this practiced detachment, unsettled him. She didn't want to be admired. She didn't even want to be seen. That made her dangerous in a way no claw ever could. He stepped closer. Her posture didn't change, but the room did. Warmer now. Not from the fire. "I don't trust many people near my son," he said. "I'm not a person," she replied, gaze not leaving the flame. "I'm a healer." Ezra looked at her then, really looked, and something in him misfired. The usual measures, the systems he used to read a threat or weigh an ally, they all failed. She was not what she should have been. She was less, and somehow more. "You'll be moved to the rooms above mine," he said. "No." "You'll be safer there." "I'm not concerned with safety. I am." Her eyes flicked toward him again. Still not afraid, but a flicker of something else now. Calculation, curiosity. "Why?" she asked. He didn't answer. Couldn't. Instead, his gaze dropped, just for a breath, to the hollow of her throat where the firelight caught on a silver pendant tucked beneath her collar. A curve of a moon, scorched at one edge. Old, burnished. It felt like a secret. When his eyes rose again, hers were waiting. They stared at each other, unblinking, the fire crackling between them like a dare. And for the first time in 5 years, Ezra didn't want to leave the room. Chapter 3. The Wolfless in the Den. The days that followed blurred together, yet time never moved slowly in the Iron Fang estate. It moved heavily, like mist dragging across stone. The house watched, as houses sometimes did when too much had happened within their walls. Its silence grew curious. Eira stayed. She slept in the chair the first night, the fire still flickering low when Ezra returned to check on Luca, and found her upright, unmoving, her eyes barely closed. He didn't speak to her, didn't ask why she hadn't taken the bed across the room or accepted the suite he'd ordered to be prepared for her. She didn't seem like the type who accepted things. By the third day, he ordered a cot brought into the room. She didn't thank him for that either. She worked with a quiet precision, never asking for help, rarely speaking. But she moved through the halls like she belonged in them. Silent, invisible, untouchable. The pack whispered when they saw her, of course. They always did. A rogue. A wolfless healer. Ezra didn't bother silencing them. Their opinions were too soft to reach her, but they reached him. He heard it when he passed the training fields, the muttered suspicions, the questions. What kind of wolf hides in the bones of a woman and never stirs? What kind of alpha brings a witch into his home? Ezra ignored them, but the sound followed him back inside. Inside, where she waited. She kept the room dim, the curtains half drawn to let in a thread of cold autumn light that slipped across the floor like a blade. When she leaned over Luca to change his bandages, Her hair spilled forward, a dark curtain shielding her face from view. Her fingers never trembled, even when the boy whimpered in pain. Her hands held a memory of stillness, like they had once calmed things that could not be tamed. Ezra watched too closely. He caught himself noticing the way her sleeves slid back to expose the pale bones of her wrists, or the way she stood after tending the boy, pausing for one breath before moving on, as if her body carried invisible weights. The heat of her presence collected around him when she passed, subtle, never meant to lure, and somehow that made it worse. He didn't speak to her unless necessary, but he stayed longer in the room each night. Luca's fever broke by the 4th day, though he hadn't yet fully woken. He stirred more, his hand sometimes seeking something in the dark and finding hers. She always sat beside him when he did, rubbing gentle circles into his back with absent-minded rhythm. Ezra came in once and found them that way. Her eyes closed. Luca's fingers curled around hers like he knew her from another life. He left before she opened her eyes. By the 5th day, she began to eat in the main kitchen, only after dusk, when most of the pack had finished. She took her food to the corner of the long table, where the fire was low, and no one dared sit too near. She never looked up when others entered. She didn't have to. They glanced once, turned away. But Ezra didn't. He came in one evening without armor, without the trappings of authority. Just a dark shirt rolled to the elbows and fatigue across his shoulders like a second skin. He poured himself a drink and stood at the end of the table without sitting, watching her with the casual quiet of someone waiting for something to unfold. She didn't meet his gaze. Instead, she set her fork down and wiped her hands with precision, like it mattered to her that no remnants of food lingered on her skin. It wasn't cleanliness. It was ritual. Distance. "You don't eat like a wolf," he said, the words slow and gravel-edged. She glanced at him then, just long enough for her eyes to flicker in the firelight. "I'm not one." The words didn't feel self-pitying. They weren't meant to wound. She simply didn't see the point in pretending. Ezra stepped closer, slowly, until the shadows no longer stood between them. She didn't look up again, but he could see the line of her throat tighten as he neared. Not from fear, from awareness, from something neither of them named. "You don't speak like one either," he said. She reached for her cup, her fingers brushing the rim in measured movement. "Perhaps I don't belong in your house." Ezra didn't answer right away. He watched the way her fingers curled, the restraint there. Watched the way she exhaled, just once, through her nose, like she regretted speaking at all. His jaw flexed. "You belong here more than most." Her eyes rose slowly. For the first time in days, she looked at him directly and didn't look away. The air in the room shifted. The crackle of the fire receded into background noise, replaced by the slow closing of distance between two people who had no intention of moving. His gaze dropped, just for a second, to the small hollow at the base of her throat. Bare now. The pendant she'd worn in the forest was gone. She had hidden it. From who? He couldn't say. But he missed its presence without knowing why. He moved past her without touching, though her arm brushed his as he did. The contact was incidental, accidental, but something in both of them coiled tight at the moment of it, His scent clung to the air for long minutes after he was gone. She finished her meal in silence. That night, she found a fresh linen robe folded at the foot of her cot. The fire had already been stoked when she entered the room. The bandages for Luca had been restocked. Everything prepared. Everything waiting. She said nothing. But she stood in front of the fire longer than usual, her fingers grazing the soft robe, her eyes unfocused. She didn't light a second candle. She didn't close the door all the way. And Ezra, 2 rooms away, stood at his own window, one hand braced on the sill, staring into the dark as if he could see her shadow through the walls. He didn't shift, didn't summon Thorn. The wolf was restless, pacing inside him with the low, silent question he refused to speak aloud. There was no claiming here, no chase, no fire waiting to be stoked. But it was building, not fast, just close. Close enough that, soon, neither of them would remember who moved first. Chapter 4. The Cold Between Them. Mornings in the Iron Fang estate came slow, filtered through pale windows thick with frost. The kind of light that never fully warmed. The kind that made every silence feel longer than it was. Eira rose early. Not because she wanted to, but because her sleep came in fits. Short spells interrupted by the weight of unfamiliar walls and the sound of her wolf pacing behind the locked door of her mind. Not awake, not gone, just turning. She washed in cold water, pulled her hair back in a tight braid, dressed in the robe he'd given her, though she never asked where it came from. It was thicker than her old one, lined with soft fur along the collar. She told herself she wore it because the room was cold, not because it still faintly carried his scent. Luca had begun to stir more often. Sometimes he mumbled, words lost between dreams. Sometimes he reached for her in sleep. Once he'd called her Mama, not in recognition, not in memory, just instinct, need. She hadn't corrected him. The boy's presence grounded her. When she touched his brow, she remembered her mother's hands. When she whispered over his fevered breaths, she used the same tones she once practiced on wounded wolves in the outer woods, the ones too broken to return to their packs. She knew how to speak to pain. It was the only language she had ever truly mastered. But Ezra was a different kind of pain. He stopped coming during the day. At least, not in ways that could be traced. She never heard his footsteps, but things in the room shifted. Blankets smoothed without her hand. Firewood always replenished. A book moved slightly on the shelf. Presence without announcement. He no longer demanded updates, no longer questioned her choices, but she knew he watched her, even when he wasn't there. She felt it when she turned too fast and caught the faint scent of him at the door, when she reached for an herb and found it freshly supplied before she'd even asked, when she turned her head in the quiet and saw no one, but the air felt heavier than it should. She hadn't spoken to him in 3 days, and yet he was always there. The cold between them wasn't distance. It was weight, thick and living. A presence neither one of them had touched, but both had begun to shape. The house had learned not to speak when they passed each other in the halls. The wolves did not stare anymore. Ezra had silenced them all, quietly, without blood. The silence was his blade now, and he wielded it ruthlessly. She found herself memorizing the sound of his steps, the way his boots landed, soft at first, then firmer with purpose. How he paused before entering a room, as if deciding whether to bring the storm inside with him. She'd never known an alpha to hold his rage so tightly. It made her want to test the seams of it. That test came on a morning like any other. She was leaning over Luca's bed, reaching for the compress bowl on the low shelf, when the handle of the door shifted. Not sharply. Slow. As if whoever stood on the other side hesitated. She knew before he entered. The weight of him was familiar now, like the ache of an old bruise. Ezra stepped into the room without speaking. She didn't turn. He said nothing, only moved past her toward the fireplace, crouched to adjust the flame. She could hear the quiet rustle of his sleeve brushing the hearth, the faint exhale he gave as he settled into a crouch. Not the sound of a man preparing to speak, just to exist nearby. Still, she didn't look at him. Instead, she leaned forward again to press the cloth against Luca's side. But something shifted behind her. His presence closer now. Not touching, not brushing, just close enough that the air between them felt thinned. "You're not sleeping," he said quietly. She froze. The words weren't an accusation, not even a question, just fact. She didn't turn, but her voice came low, even. "Neither are you." Silence stretched. Then came the second test. As she stood, Ezra reached past her shoulder to place a fresh roll of bandages on the table beside her. The movement brought him inches from her back, the sleeve of his shirt brushing against her upper arm. Not hard, not deliberate, but warm. She didn't step away, and he didn't either. They stood like that for a breath too long. The warmth of his body ghosted across her spine. The scent of him, cedar, earth, and something darker underneath, lingered in her nose. She could feel his breath stir the fine hairs at the back of her neck, feel the awareness that moved through both of them, like a slow-spreading fire. She didn't trust it. She didn't trust herself. Her fingers curled slightly around the edge of the table. Her mouth stayed closed, but her throat moved, one slow swallow that betrayed her. Behind her, Ezra's breath deepened just slightly. A pause. A shift of weight. Then he stepped away. The air cooled in his absence. She straightened slowly, gaze fixed ahead, willing herself not to look over her shoulder, not to follow him with her eyes. But she felt the drag of something unspoken between them as he crossed the room and stood near the door. He looked at her then. For the first time, not as a threat or an obligation or a woman who shouldn't have existed in his world, but as a presence he had not prepared for. A gravity pulling at his edges. "Luca asked for you." Her lips parted, but no words came. Ezra's gaze didn't move. "In his sleep, he said your name." She didn't remember telling the boy her name, but perhaps she had. Or perhaps he'd pulled it from the air, the way some creatures pull songs from stone. Still, she said nothing. Ezra's fingers brushed the doorframe once before he spoke again. "He trusts you." She turned to face him, finally, and her voice came soft, unreadable. "And you?" The question landed between them like a blade. He didn't pick it up. He left without answering. But that night, when she returned to her room, the fire was already lit, and on the table by the bed sat a single cup of tea, steaming, spiced, brewed the way she made it. No note, no explanation, just heat, and a silence that now pulsed with something new. Chapter 5. Smoke in her veins. The first snowfall of the season came with no warning. Not the light, floating kind that dusted rooftops and softened the edges of things, but the heavy kind. Thick flakes falling like ash, coating the iron-fang grounds in silence so deep it seemed to swallow sound itself. Eira stood at the tall window in the corridor, watching the storm settle over the land. She pressed her fingertips lightly to the cold glass, her breath misting the surface. Snowfall used to bring stillness to her life, a kind of peace. But in this place, it felt like a hush before something broke. Behind her, the house creaked, old bones stretching under the weight of history. She turned and made her way back toward Luca's room, her steps quiet on the stone floor. The corridor lights burned low. Ezra kept it that way. He preferred shadows over brightness, and the halls reflected that. Even during the day, there was the sense of walking through something half asleep. Luca was sitting upright now, weak, pale but awake. His eyes lit up when she entered. He reached for her hand without hesitation. Eira took it without a word and sat beside him. The boy rested his head against her arm, the way pups sometimes did when they'd lost the scent of home. She knew Ezra had been watching them, not just out of concern for his son, but something more layered, something he didn't yet understand. He hadn't spoken to her again since the moment by the table, but his presence was felt everywhere, too strongly to ignore, too often to be accidental. It came in the quiet offerings, the way her herb jars were always full, how the guards never blocked her path, the way his gaze held hers a fraction too long when they passed in the hall, even if he didn't speak. No commands, no orders, just heat. Heat like a pressure in her chest now, refusing to ease. Later that night, when Luca had drifted into a doze and the fire burned low, Eira sat alone in the chair by the hearth. The silence stretched around her. She hadn't left the room in hours. She didn't need to. The weight of her own thoughts was enough to occupy her completely. Her fingers moved absently over the edge of her satchel. She found the pendant hidden at the bottom. The old silver moon scorched black along one edge. She turned it slowly in her hands, watching the firelight catch against its rough surface. She didn't know where it had come from, only that it had always been with her, from the time she was small. Her mother had warned her never to show it, never to speak the name, etched faintly along the curve of the metal. Ashra. Her mother had whispered it only once, and with tears in her eyes. Eira had never dared say it aloud. She hadn't needed to. The wolf that name belonged to had never answered, never stirred, just lay dormant inside her, silent, still, until now. It began slowly, days earlier. A flicker in her sleep, heat curling in her spine, A sound like wind, but not outside. Inside her blood. At first, she thought it a dream. Then it came again. Last night, when she'd brushed her fingers over Luca's cheek and felt something pulse in her chest that didn't belong to her heartbeat. Now she could feel it again. Faint, but rising. Smoke without fire. Breath without body. Not a presence she could name, but one she could no longer ignore. Her skin prickled, not from cold. The door creaked open without a knock. She didn't turn. She didn't need to. His scent reached her before the sound did. Leather, firewood, rain-soaked earth. Ezra stepped into the room, closing the door behind him with a finality that made the silence thicker. Eira sat still, waiting. Ezra didn't speak. His footsteps crossed the room, stopping only when he reached the fire. He crouched there, feeding another log to the flames. The light caught across his profile. Sharpened jaw. The faint scar along his cheek. Gold eyes that never softened. She watched him from the corner of her gaze, her body still but aware. He didn't speak to her. He simply stayed. And that, somehow, was worse than words. When he finally turned, their eyes met. Not a collision, not a demand. Just the steady weight of him looking at her like she was something newly discovered and not yet trusted. She saw the questions there. Unspoken. Not the obvious ones. Not, "What are you?" or "Why are you here?" But why do I keep coming back? And worse, why don't you stop me? He moved toward her slowly, not like a predator, but like a man who had stopped pretending he wasn't hunting something. She straightened slightly, and his gaze dropped to the pendant in her hand. His expression didn't shift, but something in his breath changed. Barely audible, but real. "That symbol," he said quietly. "I've seen it before." Her fingers closed over it instinctively. Ezra didn't press. He didn't need to. He was too good at reading people, too practiced at leaving space for others to betray themselves. "I don't remember where," he added, stepping closer. "Only that it mattered." She didn't reply. The air between them thickened. The flames crackled low and warm, casting flickers of gold across the stone floor. Ezra's eyes hadn't left hers. Neither moved. Not yet. But the space between them was vanishing. Slowly, inevitably. Eira felt it, the way her pulse shifted even as her breath stayed steady. She felt the way her skin seemed to remember his warmth from days ago, from that single accidental brush that had meant nothing, but refused to be forgotten. His hand lifted, slowly. Not to touch, not yet, just to hover. Fingertips pausing a breath away from her wrist. The wolf in him, silent but restless, watched through his eyes. She could feel it. Not Thorn, but the tension he carried. Always so controlled, always caged, and still, he didn't touch her. Not her skin, but his voice did. "You're not just a healer." A statement, not a question. Her answer came softer than expected. "No." The silence bloomed again, this time heavier. Ezra lowered his hand, not in defeat, but in retreat. A calculated move. Not ready to reach, but no longer pretending he didn't want to. He stepped back once, and the air cooled. But the mark was left. A breath. A look. A nearness that echoed long after he crossed the room. She didn't watch him leave. But when the door shut behind him, she didn't move for a long time. Her fingers opened slowly. The pendant sat in her palm, warm from where she'd gripped it too tightly. And in the deepest part of her mind, something shifted. Not a voice, not a word, just the faintest curl of breath. Mine. Chapter 6. The Right and the Reckoning. The snow had stopped falling, but it had not left. It blanketed the grounds like a warning, beautiful from a distance, brutal up close. The Iron Fang territory lay still under its weight, the pack quieter than usual, the air sharper. And within the walls of the estate, something was beginning to unravel. Eira felt it. She moved through the halls with her usual silence, but her mind was no longer a still place. For nights now, something had stirred beneath the surface of her thoughts. Something ancient, half sleeping, curled like smoke in her chest. Not pain, not memory, but heat. A low, steady burn that didn't belong to her. It had a rhythm, a presence, a pull. Ashra was no longer silent. There were no words, no voices, not yet. Just sensations. Pressure beneath her skin, heat in the bones of her hands, dreams that bled gold around the edges. Sometimes, when she closed her eyes, she saw fire, not flames, but the memory of them, burning in patterns she didn't recognize. Symbols, bones, eyes that glowed without malice or mercy. She didn't tell Ezra. There were already too many questions she couldn't answer. Instead, she worked. Luca's wounds were healing fast, but she stayed close to him. He made her quieter, softer, in ways she didn't understand. The boy would reach for her hand now, not in pain, but comfort. He didn't flinch from her silences. He trusted her more than she trusted herself. Ezra had not spoken to her again since the night by the fire, but his absence was not real. He moved through the house like he was trying not to be seen, yet left evidence of himself everywhere. His scent clung to the edges of her space. His presence filled corners he never stepped into. Sometimes she caught the sound of his breath when he paused outside a door, and sometimes she found herself lingering near one of his, just to hear nothing at all. The pull between them was no longer subtle. It was constant, and they both had learned the taste of restraint. It was Elder Garen who broke it. He appeared late in the afternoon, his steps echoing against the stone as he entered the room where Eira sat. He looked older than she remembered, lean, weathered, with eyes that had seen too many lifetimes. He carried the scent of burnt sage and winter leaves, and when he stepped into the space, the temperature shifted. "Your aura is wrong," he said simply. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. The elder walked a slow circle around her, nodding to himself. He paused beside Luca, touched the boy's brow with a reverent hand, and then turned to the hearth, where a low fire still smoldered. "You've never shifted," he said. "Not a question." Eira's fingers stilled on the thread she'd been twisting. She looked at him, calm, unmoved. No. He nodded once, It's not blocked. It's buried. Again, she didn't answer. Elder Garen knelt by the fire. His movements were slow, careful. He drew a small pouch from the folds of his robe and poured a thin line of ash onto the stone in front of the flames. His voice dropped into something older then, words shaped by forgotten tongues, sounds that didn't live in the modern world. Eira sat still, spine straight, heart steady, until the scent changed. Not the smoke, the air. It shifted, sharp and sweet, like blood warmed on stone. Her skin prickled. Her pulse picked up, but not from fear. The pendant at her throat, hidden beneath her collar, grew warm. She stood without knowing why. Her feet moved toward the circle of ash, toward the fire that no longer burned orange, but flickered a deep, pulsing red. Garen did not speak. He only opened his palm, revealing a small shard of bone, ancient and dark. He dropped it into the flames. Everything stopped. And then her wolf opened its eyes. It was not loud. It was not violent. It was there. Eira staggered. Her breath caught in her throat. The world around her dimmed and lit all at once. Her knees hit the floor, hands braced against stone, as something vast and burning rose up from inside her. Her heart pounded once, hard enough to shake her bones. Then she heard it. Not a sound. A name. Ashra. Her wolf did not roar. She whispered, and that whisper filled every corner of her body with heat. Ezra was already running by the time the energy spiked. He felt it the moment it happened, like a blow to the chest. Thorn snapped awake, wild in his skin, demanding movement, demanding her. No words, no hesitation. Just need. The door slammed open, and Ezra found her on the floor. She was glowing. Not in the way of power. There were no sparks, no magic curling from her hands, but her skin was lit from within, flushed with something raw and wild and real. Her eyes were closed, lips parted in a silent gasp, hands pressed against the floor, as if anchoring her to this world. Garen stood motionless, as if afraid to interrupt something divine. Ezra stepped forward. The second he crossed the threshold, her eyes snapped open. Ash gray no longer, now glowing faint gold. They locked onto his, and the air between them burned. Ezra didn't speak. He couldn't. His voice belonged to someone else now. Someone watching from inside his chest, teeth bared, claws flexed. Mine. The word came not from Thorn, but from something older. A call. A memory. A bond unspoken. She rose slowly, her body shaking, but her gaze never left his. He moved toward her without thought, each step harder than the last. The closer he got, the tighter the tension pulled between them. Not lust. Not yet. Something deeper. Something dangerous. Ezra reached for her, and for the first time, she didn't pull away. Her fingers met his, and the moment they touched, something inside both of them cracked open. Heat spilled between their palms, a pulse neither one of them controlled. She gasped, not from fear, but recognition. He stepped closer, his hand rising to cup the side of her face, rough thumb grazing her cheekbone. Still no words. Her skin trembled under his touch. His breath hitched. They didn't kiss, but it was closer than anything he'd known. The fire behind them flared. Garen stepped back, whispering a prayer to a god long forgotten. Ezra didn't move. Neither did she. And in the silence that followed, only one thing remained between them, tension drawn so tightly it had nowhere else to go but deeper. Chapter 7. The Bond Beneath the Blood. The days after the awakening did not unfold gently. Power, once stirred, did not settle back into silence. Eira moved differently now. She no longer passed through the corridors unnoticed. The wolves felt it when she entered a room, not through scent or sound, but through something deeper, older. She walked with the kind of quiet that made others nervous, the kind of calm that suggested restraint, not absence. The air bent around her without warning. The firelight followed her like it knew her name. Her wolf did not speak, but it watched. And Ezra felt it. He noticed it in the way her gaze lingered now, not in challenge, but in awareness. He noticed it in the way her presence pressed closer without touching, in the way her voice dropped when she spoke to Luca, in the way his son leaned into her without fear. Even in silence, she filled the room. She wore the robe he'd left her every night now, not always fully tied, the neckline loose around her collarbone, exposing the line of her throat and the delicate chain she no longer hid beneath layers. The pendant rested where his gaze kept returning, just below the hollow of her throat, warm against her skin. He knew it shouldn't matter, but it did. The rest of the pack felt it too. They moved around her carefully now, not with disdain, but with uncertainty. Ezra had said nothing publicly, but Garen's ritual had not gone unseen. A wolf with a dormant soul awakening in the center of the Alpha's house. The rumors came fast and sharp. Still, none confronted her. And those who once whispered now lowered their eyes when she passed. It was Ezra they looked to for guidance, and he offered none. He was too busy watching her. Every day, he found a reason to be in her space. He told himself it was for Luca, for Garen, for the politics beginning to stir beyond the borders. But it wasn't. It was her. The way she moved across the room with purpose, every gesture spare but precise. The way her fingertips brushed the edge of a table when she paused, grounding herself with small touches, as if trying to measure the weight of her own body again. The way her wolf, Ashra, flickered behind her eyes when she stared too long at the fire. She had not shifted, but Ezra could sense the shape of her. Not just powerful, old. He wasn't afraid of her, but he was beginning to fear what she made him feel. She was not his mate, at least not the first. He had buried his mate years ago, burned her body himself, laid her to rest beneath iron and stone. But still, something in him clawed toward Eira without warning, something in Thorn that paced too close to her scent, that stilled whenever she entered a room, that whispered in the space between heartbeats. It was a mistake, he told himself, a trick of fate. There could be no second mate, no true bond after what he'd lost. This thing between them, it wasn't destiny, it was proximity. A necessary arrangement, grown too warm. And yet, that night, when she passed him in the corridor without a word, he turned. Not immediately, not quickly, just enough to follow. She paused at the end of the hall, her back to him, her fingers lightly touching the carved stone arch. She didn't speak, didn't look at him, but she waited. He stepped into the alcove behind her, close enough to hear the breath she held in her chest. The space between them narrowed again. It was becoming a pattern. He didn't reach for her, but she turned, slowly, deliberately, and their eyes met in the low amber light. She didn't speak. Neither did he, but the air between them changed. He could feel the pulse of her power beneath her skin, not lashing out, just there, humming like a second heartbeat. Her mouth was parted slightly, not in invitation, not in surprise, just enough to draw breath and hold it. He took a step closer. She didn't move. The back of his hand brushed her hip, barely a touch, a momentary contact, but her body responded with a stillness so complete it trembled. He didn't pull away. Her fingers rose, not to push him back, but to hover near his chest, not touching, just near. Her eyes stayed on his, steady and unblinking. The house around them faded. The stone, the weight, the rules. What remained was the smell of frost in her hair, the fire in her skin, the soft, deliberate tension that bound them in silence. And he couldn't stop watching her mouth. When she finally blinked, it was slow, heavy, like a decision being made in real time. He should have walked away. But instead, his hand rose, brushed a loose strand of hair from her face, let his thumb graze the edge of her jaw with the kind of restraint that frayed everything else. He felt her breath catch, felt her lean, almost imperceptibly, toward the warmth of his palm. Still, she didn't speak, but her eyes said what her mouth did not. "I won't stop you." Ezra bent slightly, the barest tilt of his head, and the distance between them vanished into heat. Their foreheads touched. Not lips. Not yet. Just skin to skin. A point of contact that should have meant nothing, but carried the weight of everything they hadn't said. Eira inhaled, and the world inhaled with her. He stayed like that for a moment, still and braced, as if holding himself back was more painful than letting go. And then, a knock on the far hall. Voices. A breathless messenger. He stepped back. The air between them cooled instantly. Eira looked down, fingers flexing at her side. Ezra didn't move, didn't speak. The moment hung between them, suspended, unfinished. But as she walked away, silent, poised, untouched in all the ways that mattered most, he knew something had shifted. This bond, whatever it was, however unwanted, it was no longer a matter of time. It had already begun. Chapter 8. Second mate, first wound. The thaw came slow that year. Snow melted in uneven patches, leaving behind a landscape of pale fog and damp earth, the air heavy with the scent of iron and pine. Within the Iron Fang estate, however, the cold had not retreated. It had settled into the walls, into the very rhythm of each day. And in that quiet chill, Eira began to feel the weight of something she did not understand fully yet. Something that bound her to the Alpha in ways she could neither welcome nor escape. Ezra had become a constant presence. He was not always near, yet she could sense him the way one senses the pressure before a storm, the tightening of air, the subtle shift of heat before lightning strikes. When she moved through the halls, his scent lingered faintly. Smoke, pine, and something distinctly him. Sometimes she caught him watching from a distance, saying nothing, his eyes unreadable. He never stayed long enough for a confrontation, but his silence spoke of a man at war with himself. She did not seek him out, but her thoughts betrayed her. The memory of his voice lingered like the echo of thunder, soft and low, reaching into places she had long forgotten existed. There was a pull to him now, a rhythm that her body seemed to recognize even when her mind resisted. Every time their paths crossed, that pulse deepened. It was not affection nor comfort. It was gravity. It was something older than them both, something that felt like recognition, written in the marrow of her bones. She told herself it was the bond between healer and patient, between protector and guest. But her wolf, newly awakened and restless, knew better. Ashra stirred when Ezra entered a room, an instinctive hum that vibrated through her blood. Eira tried to suppress it, to bury it beneath discipline and silence. She had lived without a wolf for years. Now this awakening felt too vast, too fierce, and yet she could not bring herself to wish it undone. The first time she felt the truth of it was not in a touch or a look, but in a silence. Ezra came to her chamber late one night, after the house had settled into uneasy stillness. She had been reading beside the fire, her hair loose over her shoulders. The robe he had given her pulled close at the throat. When the door opened, she didn't look up immediately. She didn't need to. The shift in the air announced him before his shadow touched the floor. He stood there without speaking, his presence filling the room like a slow tide. She could hear his breathing, deep but uneven, the kind that came from a man who had spent the day wrestling something larger than words. The tension between them was no longer new, but tonight it had a different shape, less guarded, more dangerous. He crossed the space between them in silence and stopped behind her chair. The heat of him reached her before his voice did. "You shouldn't stay up so late." The words were simple, but they carried something else, concern disguised as command. She didn't answer right away, letting the moment draw long enough to taste the hesitation in his breath. "I couldn't sleep," she said finally, her voice quiet but steady. "Because of what happened with Garen." She hesitated. "Because of what's happening inside me." Ezra moved then, just enough that she could feel him close behind her shoulder. He didn't touch her. He didn't need to. His presence was an intrusion she no longer had the strength to resist. She turned her head slightly, and for a heartbeat, their eyes met. There was something unguarded in his face, a trace of sorrow, of want, of fear he hadn't learned to name. "You're changing," he said. "I know." "You're stronger than before." "I can feel it." He took another step closer, his shadow falling over hers, the firelight catching the edge of his jaw. The space between them was a single breath, a single thought. "Do you know what it means?" His voice was low now, quieter than the crackle of the flames. Eira's fingers tightened on the book in her lap, her knuckles pale against the dark cover. "No," she whispered, "and I think you do." Ezra didn't answer at once. His eyes searched hers, and for a moment the walls between them wavered. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of something he had held too long. "It means you're mine." The words settled into the room like smoke, slow and consuming. Eira went still. Not because of the claim, but because of the certainty in his tone. There was no arrogance in it, no dominance, just truth. A truth that terrified her more than any threat ever could. She stood, the book sliding soundlessly from her lap to the floor. For a long time, she didn't speak. The firelight shifted across her face, tracing the outline of her cheekbones, the curve of her mouth, the subtle tremor in her breath. "I am not her," she said finally. "I know. I will never be her. I don't want you to be." His voice broke on the last word, quiet but raw. The distance between them disappeared, erased not by a step, but by something deeper, by the gravity that had been building since the night he found her in the forest. She could feel his warmth now, the heat of his body against hers without contact, the steady rhythm of his heart echoing faintly in her chest. Her hand lifted before she realized it. She placed her palm lightly against his chest, right over that heartbeat. It was a gesture of defiance and surrender in equal measure. The bond surged through her at the touch, a deep, steady pulse that did not belong to magic or power, but to something older. It was recognition, connection. Ezra's breath hitched. He didn't move. He let her hand stay there, as if afraid that any movement would break the moment. "I didn't ask for this," she said quietly. "Neither did I." The words hung between them, fragile and heavy. Her hand remained on his chest, the warmth of his skin seeping into her palm. The fire cracked, sending a thin line of light across the floor, catching the edge of her robe, the pendant at her throat. Ezra's gaze followed it, lingering there before rising to her face. "If this bond is real," she said after a long silence, "it will ruin us both." Ezra's voice came softer, almost tender. "It already has." For a moment, neither moved. The bond between them pulsed once more, a quiet, painful truth. Then, with slow precision, Eira withdrew her hand and stepped back. Ezra let her go. He didn't stop her, didn't speak again. When she turned toward the door, the firelight caught the edge of her eyes, and he saw it there, the faint shimmer of gold beneath the gray. Her wolf, awake, aware. Eira didn't look back as she left the room, but long after the door closed behind her, Ezra remained where she had stood, her warmth still imprinted on his skin. And for the first time in years, he realized he wasn't angry anymore. He was afraid, because he finally understood what fate had given him. Not a second chance at love, but a second wound that might never heal. Chapter 9. Fire in the Veins. The sun never quite rose the next morning. Gray light filtered through the clouds, thin and colorless, casting the forest in muted hues of bone and ash. The storm had come and gone, but its presence lingered in the silence. Trees leaned as if listening. The air buzzed with the promise of violence. Inside the Iron Fang estate, the quiet had grown too deep, the kind that precedes disruption, the kind that warns without sound. Eira felt it before she heard the steps in the snow. She stood at the window of the west wing, one hand resting against the cold pane, her eyes drawn to the edge of the trees. There was movement there, brief flashes of dark shapes between branches. Not Ezra's patrols, not Iron Fang wolves. She didn't need to see them clearly to understand what they were. Rogues, unaligned, uninvited, desperate. She left the room without thinking, her body moving before her mind caught up. The house seemed to know her now, doors yielding to her touch, corridors parting in silence. She reached the main hall just as the alarms were raised, the low, pulsing sound of the old bells echoing through the stone, like a heartbeat too close to panic. Wolves moved past her in flashes of movement, pack guards racing to their stations, claws unsheathed, teeth bared. Eira didn't follow them. She turned instead toward the north wing, toward the room where Luca slept, unaware of the danger. She found him half-dressed, rubbing sleep from his eyes, his small frame tense with confusion. "Stay here," she said softly, brushing the hair from his face. He frowned. "Where's my dad?" Eira's hand paused on his cheek. "He's already outside." The wind howled against the stone as she stepped back. Luca reached for her without thinking, and she caught his hand, holding it for a breath longer than necessary. "I'll come back," she said. And then she was gone. Outside, the snow churned underfoot. The rogue wolves were already in the clearing, 10 of them at least, their forms shifting in and out of partial shift. Claws grown, eyes wild, coats bristling with frost and hunger. They weren't here to challenge territory. They were here to send a message. Ezra stood at the center of the line, flanked by his pack. Thorn had not yet taken over, but his presence was thick in Ezra's stance. He radiated threat. His voice cut through the wind, low and even, the kind that made lesser wolves tremble. "Leave. Now." The leader of the rogues, broad-shouldered, fur streaked with old scars, smirked as he stepped forward. "You've grown soft, Draven, hiding behind healers and old stories." Eira arrived just as the rogue's gaze shifted to her. His grin widened. "Ah, the she-wolf. The one they whisper about." Ezra's head turned slightly, just enough to see her. His jaw tightened. He hadn't wanted her out here. She knew it by the look in his eyes, but he said nothing. The rogue took another step. "They say you're his second, that you carry power even you don't understand." Eira stood still. Her heartbeat was steady, but the energy under her skin had begun to stir. Ashra was close now, closer than she'd ever been. The presence inside her pulsed with anticipation. Not fear, not fury, something more complete. She stepped forward without speaking, placing herself beside Ezra, not behind him. The rogue barked a laugh. How touching. The widow and his replacement. Before Ezra could move, Eira did. It wasn't a shift, not yet. But her power rippled outward like heat escaping the earth. The snow around her feet steamed. Her eyes flared gold. The wolves nearest her staggered back, their own instincts overriding their commands. Even Ezra turned his head more fully toward her now, his expression unreadable, the tension in his shoulders no longer controlled. Ashra rose, not in a violent burst, but in a quiet surge of presence. Eira didn't have to command. Her body did. Her silence did. She walked forward, and the ground seemed to lean toward her. The rogue tried to lunge. He didn't make it far. A pulse of force struck him mid-stride, not a blow of claw or fang, but raw will, an energy that pinned him to the ground with a sudden, crushing silence. Eira stood over him, unmoved. The others hesitated. Even the wolves behind Ezra faltered, watching her with something close to awe. She looked down at the rogue without a trace of anger. "Go," she said, her voice low, threaded with something ancient. The rogue scrambled up, eyes wide. He didn't speak again. The others followed, melting into the trees with the frantic grace of predators turned prey. The clearing fell still. Ezra watched her, not like a man grateful to have been saved, not like an alpha calculating her worth. He watched her like a man who had finally seen what had been living beside him this whole time. She turned to him slowly. Their eyes met. Neither moved. The cold no longer touched them. He stepped forward, each pace deliberate, as if crossing a boundary only now visible. His hand reached out, not commanding, not claiming, simply asking. She let him touch her. His palm found her waist. Her hand slid to his chest. They did not kiss. They didn't need to. The bond between them wasn't subtle anymore. It vibrated through the air, a live wire stretched too thin. His breath touched her mouth. Hers paused in her throat. There was nothing left to deny. Not the heat. Not the power. Not the terrible, beautiful thing growing between them. And as the wind circled around their bodies, as the sky held its breath, they stood there, two wolves shaped by loss, called by fate, held not by chains, but by a bond neither had asked for, and both were helpless to escape. This was not surrender. This was recognition. Chapter 10. The Crown and the Flame. The quiet after the confrontation settled like falling ash. Soft, but final. The pack did not speak of the rogues. They didn't need to. Power had shifted in the clearing, and everyone had felt it. Something had changed in the way the wolves looked at Eira. Not with suspicion now, but with something closer to awe. Still cautious. Still uncertain. But no longer blind. Ezra's word was law in Iron Fang. But hers had become something else entirely. Something older than law. No formal announcement followed. No ceremony or decree. Ezra didn't summon the pack to declare her status, nor did Eira step forward to claim a title. It was unnecessary. Those who had doubted before had seen enough. They didn't need names to know what she was to him now. She hadn't left his side since that night in the snow. Not out of duty. Not from fear. Because she no longer wished to be anywhere else. Days passed quietly. No threat stirred on the borders. The walls of the estate, always heavy with memory, began to feel less oppressive. Ezra moved with a stillness that wasn't caution. It was presence. He lingered in the same rooms as her now, not watching, not guarding. Simply being. She had begun to occupy his space without asking. and he had stopped pretending he didn't want her there. It happened one evening, as twilight bled into the sky, and a soft wind moved through the open windows. Eira stood by the fire in Ezra's quarters, her fingers tracing the spine of a worn book she had not bothered reading. Her robe slipped slightly off one shoulder, the delicate fabric catching the glow of the hearth, her bare collarbone casting a subtle shadow across her chest. Ezra sat in his chair, watching her with a stillness that had nothing to do with patience. He hadn't touched her since that moment in the clearing, though the space between them had grown smaller with each passing day. Tension no longer pulsed in the silence. It burned in it. Eira didn't need to speak. She only turned her head and met his gaze. That was all it took. He stood slowly, each step deliberate, as if savoring the distance he was about to erase. When he reached her, he didn't ask permission. He didn't need to. His hand lifted to her face, fingers brushing the line of her jaw, his touch reverent and warm. Her eyes fluttered closed, not from shyness, but from surrender, the kind that came not with submission, but with certainty. She reached for him in return, her fingers sliding over the fabric of his shirt, finding the beat of his heart. It was steady, strong, but when she leaned in, brushing her lips near the corner of his mouth, he trembled beneath her touch. Ezra kissed her like a man who had spent years holding his breath. It wasn't hunger that moved him. It was reverence. He kissed her slowly, fully, as if learning the shape of something sacred. His hand slid to her waist, drawing her closer, the fabric of her robe parting beneath his fingers. She pressed into him, every inch of her body fitting against the hardness of his frame, the bond between them pulsing, not just through blood now, but through flesh. She wasn't soft, not in the way he had remembered softness. Eira was fire contained in skin, heat bound by control. But that control slipped now, willingly, completely. Her hands found his shoulders, her mouth parting beneath his, a sound escaping her lips that curled straight through his spine. Ezra lifted her in one swift motion, her legs wrapping around his waist, her breath catching against his throat. He carried her to the bed without ceremony, laying her down with a reverence that was almost painful. She didn't look away from him once. In the low light, he studied her, the curve of her hips, the slope of her thighs, the faint scar near her navel. He moved over her like a man claiming nothing, only returning home. She guided his hand beneath her robe, her skin burning beneath his palm, her breath warm against his mouth as she whispered his name, not as a question, not as a plea, as a promise. Theirs was not a rushed joining. There was no violence in it, no hunger that threatened to consume. It was something deeper, slower. Each movement drawn out with care, every brush of skin deliberate, as if they were learning each other one breath at a time. Their wolves stirred beneath the surface, not with urgency, but with a knowing silence. This was not the fire of conquest. This was the warmth that followed it, the heat that refused to leave long after the flames died down. He held her afterward, their bodies tangled in the sheets, their breaths slow, uneven. His fingers traced the edge of her jaw, her temple, the hollow beneath her throat. She didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. She only lay there, eyes half closed, her body still humming from the bond that had finally been made real. Neither spoke. There was no need. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees, and for the first time in years, Ezra didn't feel the weight of his crown pressing into his spine. He felt her instead, her warmth, her breath, her skin against his, and in that quiet, the Alpha was no longer alone. He had not chosen her. Fate had, and this time, he did not resist. He reached for her hand and laced his fingers through hers. Eira turned her head toward him, eyes open now, her voice soft. "So this is what it feels like," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "To burn," she added. Ezra's lips brushed her forehead. "No," he murmured, "to belong." And when her eyes closed again, he knew she would not run. Not from this, not from him. She had been forged in exile. He had been shaped by loss. But together, flame and stone, healer and king, they had become something else entirely. Unbreakable,